Dear learners, welcome to live teleconferencing session. Me, myself, Dr. A. Senthamizh Kanal from Faculty of Public Administration. In this session, we will discuss about disaster management strategy. This topic comes under PPAG 171 disaster management. So far, we have discussed many times about what is disaster management and what are the various activities which are related to. In this session, particularly, we are focusing upon the disaster management strategy. As you all know that disaster have a wider repercussions on the society. It leads to huge losses and damages also, and it's not a local phenomenon, or it used to happen in a particular phenomenon. It used to happening everywhere. It's a global phenomenon due to extreme weather condition, population growth, unplanned urbanization, demographic changes, and increasing pressure on lower natural resources. These are the major factor for the that disaster losses and all. Not only disaster pose a threat to the development strategy of nation, as they destroy the productive capacity, interrupt economic and social activity, and create irreversible changes in the natural resource base. Okay, it's not only that when disaster happen, it used to affect the lives and livelihood, lives and infrastructure. Also, it used to affect the nation's economic capacity also, and used to productive capacity also. It used to interrupt the economic and social activity also. So earlier, like traditionally, we can say that this as a strategy for disaster management, it has been preparing and managing the aftermath of the sudden events. That earlier, like I am telling about 1990s. Why I am mentioning about 1990s, I will discuss in the later. Before 1990s, it was like preparing. We have to make the people to prepare and managing the aftermath of the disaster incidents. So what do you mean by aftermath of the disaster incidents? Aftermath of the disaster incident is once a disaster happened, the government or government, non-government, they used to provide the relief and rehabilitation materials to the people. Okay, it just to provide the relief oriented approach. It was always felt that it overwhelmed the capacity of the nations and communities, and we are facing the lot of several hardships. Okay, it's not only disaster not only affect the, as I said, that not only lives and livelihood, it will make a hardship in the communities and nation and all. So in such scenario where the disasters are making huge setback to development, so it is important to reflect whether a disaster can be avoided or not. So if you think over that, whether we avoid the disaster, no, we can't avoid the disaster, but we can minimize the loss of the disaster only. Okay, as I mentioned that before 1990s, after that gradually by 1990s, what happened, a change in the perception after the disaster was visible. They are no longer they consider disaster are not as sudden occurrences. Okay, this handled by the emergency response and services. That disaster prevention, which was not an it was not a developmental activity. Disaster prevention as a, it is not a priority also, but it has given a new dimension to the disaster management activity, and a new general awareness is beginning generated that disaster can be minimized through the improved development planning and implementation also. So with the with the adoption of international decade of national disaster risk reduction, in since the 1990s, the way disaster had been looked changed into worldwide, it has been changed. So it happened through the International Decade for Natural Disaster Risk Reduction Convention since the 1990s. The relief-oriented approach changed into the risk reduction approach. So with the change of approach, there was a more focus towards the adopting strategy that help in disaster risk reduction. Like for example, as I already mentioned, that relief oriented approach is that, like it's just a reactive approach. but it's a risk reduction reduction in the sense, like you are reducing the risk of factor and improve the vulnerability conditions of the people and improve the capacity of the communities. And also, so the disaster management strategies focused on various components like improving capacities of the communities, adopting prevention and the mitigation measures and all. So now we are going to look into the disaster management strategy, some kind of a perspective. So theoretically, how it has been mentioned that when you are dealing with the disaster situations, different strategies are suggested by the different scholars at forums at the international level. There was that a comprehensive definition has been given by the UNISDR, that is United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, that is UNISDR. They said that disaster risk management as a is a systematic process of using administrative decisions, organizations, operational skills, and capacities to implement policies, strategies, coping capacity of the society and community, and lessen the impact of the natural disaster and related to environmental and technological disaster. In this definition, you can identify that here they have mentioned that with the community to reduce the lessen the impacts of the natural disaster or other related environmental and technological disaster. In our previous, that earlier what we used to do, we used to manage the disaster, we used to produce the relief materials to the disaster. So however, if you look into there was a comprehensive strategy, global level, not beyond like a global level. If you take it into that, one country strategy doesn't suit for the another country. Okay, so that time what used to happen, the local knowledge and the indigenous thought should be pulled in, and they have to make a region wise specific disaster and all. So for example, if you look into that author Capcho and Van Martz, they said that the disaster management should be it should be innovative problem solving, it should be horizontal adoption, it should be more collaboration, have to create a relationship based on trust, and we have to provide better public support leadership, decentralized decision making, and intensive human interaction are critical for the success of the disaster response. This was suggested by the Walmart. These are the basic strategies, and as per the Federal Emergency Management Agency of the US, they suggested that a disaster management strategy should have a proper direction and control. They have a proper communication, warning, emergency public information, evacuation or in-place sheltering, mass care, health and medical, and the resource management. These are the theoretical perspective of the some of the major strategies for the disaster management. If you look into that, though, these strategies do deal with the disaster can have a comprehensive outlook. It should also have flexibility to make necessary changes based on the local context and the challenges ahead also. This is the most important one. Whatever your strategy, like for example, if you look into that, we are saying whatever you are making for that any strategy, it won't applicable to India. Okay, even if you take in India, we also length and breadth, we are too length and breadth, we are a huge country. Okay, the some kind of measurement, some kind of a framework, it doesn't suit to the other parts of the state also. So we have to make the improve the we have to adopt the local planning with the help of the local community, and we have to improve the capacity of the communities and all. So these are the basic perspective of the disaster management strategies. Now we are moving to the international strategies for disaster management. So why I am coming discuss here, I am discussing about the international strategy for disaster management. As I already mentioned that the way of looking into the disaster has been changed into after the International Decade for National Disaster Reduction, that is 1990s. So we after that there was a strategy called Yokohama Strategy for Disaster Reduction and Higo Framework for Disaster Reduction, and that one is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Reduction. In this session, we will discuss detailedly about that. All the things. The first one is that International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. 1990s was the declared as the international decade for the national disaster reduction by the United Nations Assembly on the December 11th and 1987. Okay, why it has happened is that to prevent the adverse effect and impact of the natural disaster, they have announced that the 1990s as the international decade for natural disaster reduction. Okay, it was it was the United Nation was adopted on the resolution on 22nd day of December 1989 that states that to reduce through concerted international action to the loss of life and the disruption caused by the natural disasters and all. So based on that, the United Nations set up a decades goal with a focus on improving capacity of the developing countries to mitigate the effects of the natural disaster. So then that, and also the resolution sought the developing nation to design guidelines strategy applying scientific and technical knowledge also. So for example that that forum has been developed, it has to suggested all the countries to create a framework and guidelines for and also in this IDNDR convention they said that they have given importance to planning and implementation of the disaster management at the national level and integration of the disaster prevention policies with the development program. This one is the more important one. For example, disaster management activity is a part and parcel of the, it is it is a connection, it is a collective activity. You can't divide the disaster management activities and all. If you have a proper road and network connection communication, you can reach easily to the hospital when you are affected disaster, or we can move out of the place and all. If you have a proper strong construction, then you can avoid the flood or cyclone. So likewise, that integration of the disaster prevention policy with the development program, like for example nowadays rainwater harvesting, they are made compulsory to all the houses, so it used to reduce the water shortage. So likewise they have suggested that integration of disaster prevention policy with the development program. And another thing is that emphasis on community preparedness by education and training on the prevention, preparedness, life relief and recovery. So this is the most important one, because community are the first respondent to the disaster. So if you improve the communities for the activities of preparedness, prevention, relief and activity, that would be entirely different. And they have emphasized also in that IDNR convention, developing nations to pay substantial attention to the socio-economic infrastructure and concentrate on providing human shelters and proper healthcare facility to mitigate the vulnerability at the same time of disaster. Here, socio and economic infrastructure in the sense, you have to improve the education of the people, you have to improve the capacities of the people, you have to improve the economic condition of the people. How to improve the economic condition? If you provide the proper livelihood opportunity, automatically they will improve the economic opportunity and all. So it is you that idea, and they have given a holistic approach. That was the first one. That's why I mentioned that before 1990 is after 1990. So after the convention, the way of looking at the disaster has been entirely changed. So now we are moving into the Yokohama strategy for disaster reduction. So now what happened, that once they have started following IDNDR, then after that they made a mid-term review how it's working and all. So they all met in that World Conference on Natural Risk Reduction held at 1994 in Yokohama, Japan. In this conference, they have adopted like a Yokohama strategy plan of action. This conference, this conference played a significant role, in motivating the developing countries in changing relief-oriented approach into the one based to the approach. In that strategy, they have suggested a few of the components, like earlier they have mentioned that in that convention, that strategy, they said that risk assessment is the major steps for adoption of successful disaster risk policy and measures. Okay, first you have to make the risk assessment. Like for example, now if you go into any like we have a national disaster management plan, we have a state disaster management plan, we have a district disaster management plan. Nowadays we are having a block level disaster management plan. In some village, some places we have a village disaster management plan. This plan, what used to happen, they used to provide the strength weakness of the village or place about that. So risk assessment is the major assessment. So first, if you know the risk, then you can automatically respond to that only. And another one is that disaster preparedness and prevention as the integral aspect of the planning in the development policy. As I already mentioned, that whatever the development planning or program is happening, we have to incorporate the component of disaster prevention and preparedness and prevention. And another one is the development and strengthening of capacity. So you have to improve the capacity of the community. And the another one is that they suggested that early warning of impending disaster and the dissemination of information. So this one is the more important one. Like for example, nowadays information is doesn't matter, but earlier days that they said the earlier warning impending disaster. So dissemination of information to the people is the more important one, and they have suggested that promote participation at all the levels, like local, regional, national and the international level. And we have to provide a free access to necessary standards also. All this, that we have to give proper environmental protection with consistent with proper poverty alleviation and all. Okay, so these through these risk reduction strategies, the varying impact of disaster can be considerably reduced, if not eliminated. Like for example, again, and I'm telling you, if you follow these are the strategy used to reduce the risk of the disaster only. You can't avoid the eliminate, you can't avoid the disaster. Like you can't avoid the cyclone, you can't avoid the earthquake, you can't avoid the landslide, you can't avoid this hailstorm. So you can't avoid anything, but you can minimize the impact of the disaster. That's what these are the strategies were suggesting and improving and all. You know that these were like above I mentioned that it was mentioned in the Yokohama strategy, but it could not be taken up sufficient to cope up with the multiplying challenges of disaster. Like there was a that lot of gap in the governance, risk identification, assessment, monitoring, knowledge management. So there are various things also there in that Yokohama strategy. So after that, Hyogo framework for disaster reduction. In that one is that the whatever the gaps, whatever the problem, whatever the shortness where has been identified in the Yokohama strategies were addressed in the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, Kobe, Japan in 2005. It was held in the hypothesis that it used to be more comprehensive approach for needed for the proper management of disaster. Okay, so for that they have introduced the Hyogo framework of action, and Hyogo declaration set out a result oriented plan of action for the 2005 to 15. Okay, like for example, from beginning, IDR, Yokohama strategy. Then after that, they introduced the Hyogo framework. So it is a constant improvement. They whatever the shortcoming they have faced before that, it has been addressed. And in the Hyogo framework, they have said that in 2005 to 2015, we have to achieve these are the target. So in this Hyogo framework, they have suggested some kind of methods, or you can say anything that they mentioned that effective integration of. In that, I am just going to spell out only important points. Only they have listed a very lot of points. In that, they mentioned that integration of disaster risk consideration into the sustainable development policy, planning, programming at all levels. The emphasis of disaster prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and vulnerability reduction. Like for example, if you are the any policies or programs are implementing, if any disaster happen, it will automatically affect the sustainability of the program only. So for that, you have to give more importance in the policies. You have to add the component of prevention, mitigation, and the other disaster management component. And another important thing what they are saying that strengthening of institution and the capacity of art level at the especially at the community level. Like for example, in India also, we earlier disaster management was with the Ministry of Agriculture. After that, we have created. After that, it has more. It has slowly changed into the various level. Now we have a full-fledged National Disaster Management Authority, and state level State Disaster Management Authority, and the district level District Disaster Management Authority. So these are the things they have suggested in 2000, that strengthening of institution and capacities at all levels also. And another important component they suggested that integrated multi-hazard approach to disaster risk reduction should be factored on policies, planning and programming related to sustainable development, relief, rehabilitation and reconstruction and post-disaster or post-conflict situation in the disaster-prone countries. Okay, though, like for example, compared to others, the Hugo framework has provided new measure to deal with the disaster management. It that some people said that it seemed to be an old wine in a new bottle, and repeatedly we are focusing upon that prevention, preparedness, mitigation, and recovery. So these are the three marks. But whatever it is, these are the three marks where the it's a landmarks in the international level regarding to the disaster management. So another important one is that Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. During the United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, which was held in Sendai, Japan in June 2015, they have mentioned the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. It was the post major agreement of the post 2015 agenda. In this, they have mentioned is the four priorities of action and seven targets. In the four priority, first one is the understanding disaster risk, and the second one is in strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk, and the third one is investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, and fourth one is the enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response that build back better in recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. In that first priority, like understanding disaster risk, here they have mentioned that disaster risk management should be based on the understanding of disaster risk in all dimensions, like vulnerability, capacity, exposure of the persons and assets, hazard characteristics and the environment, so that such knowledge can be used for the risk assessment, prevention, mitigation. And then second priority is that you have to strengthen the disaster risk governance to manage the at the national, regional, at the local level for the managing disaster. And third one is that investing in DRR for resilience. Here, investing in that public and private investment in disaster risk prevention and reduction through structural and non-structural measures are essential for the, like for example, to enhance the economic, social, health and cultural resilience of the persons, communities and countries, and as other environment factor also. And then fourth one is that build back better. The build back betterment means the growth of disaster risk means that there is a need to strengthen disaster preparedness for response, take action in anticipation of events, and ensure capacity are in place for effective response and recovery at all levels also. So the recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction factors are the critical factor for the build back factor, including the integration of disaster risk reduction into development programs and all. So these are the four priorities they have suggested the countries to give more time, give more focus upon the all these four priorities. First, you should understand the risk. Okay, you can't treat high earthquake and flood in the same manner. Okay, you have to give proper understanding of the disaster risk, and you have to give the disaster risk governance in the sense, you can say administration, policies and various institutions and non-governmental institution, communities. So you have to strengthen the disaster risk governance, and you have to improve the investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. You have to be increase the disaster insurance, and the fourth one is that you have to create a proper build back better and all. So build back better is the relief, rehabilitation and reconstruction. If you have a proper build back better, then automatically you will bring the resilience of the community. So, in spite of all the strategies, framework, and guidance, and managing a disaster, it's not an easy task because of multiple issues, complexities involved in that. Most of the time, management of disaster is mainly due to the proper poor handling of disaster events by the managers and government, and sometimes victims themselves who pay the less warnings issued by them. And also, so towards the end, so here I want to end that here is that instead of disaster management, we are going to in the these strategies are more and more focusing upon the risk reduction activity, because instead we can't eliminate the disaster, but somehow we can manage the disaster, we can reduce the risk of the disaster. That was the major strategy for the in this objectives of the various strategy. Thanks a lot for listening. Thank you.
Do you know that the world's population has reached 8 billion on 15th November 2022? And we are still counting. I don't know where do we go from here. The predictions are scary. Any idea how many people can Mother Earth sustain? India's growing population is a serious concern, and we are soon going to become the world's most populous country. Wow, number one. Population is, after all, a human issue. The UN proposed Sustainable Development Goals cannot be achieved unless and until we consider the population dynamics. So, here we are.